Thank you very much. I want to welcome everyone this morning to what I think is a really wonderful event, remembering Jan Nowak, and I want to thank Ambassador Schneff of the Polish Embassy for asking us to do this, because Jan was a very warm personal friend and a very, very dear friend of the National Endowment for Democracy. When I arrived at NED a long time ago, in 1984, in the spring, one of the first things that greeted me was a long letter from Jan Nowak explaining that the survival of Solidarity 2.5 years after martial law was imposed, and this is a quote, represents an unprecedented challenge to the omnipotence of the Soviet totalitarian system, as a result of which support for the democratic movement in Poland should have the highest priority for the NED in terms of our funding allocations and urgency of action. Jan often used the word urgent, and what he was proposing invariably was urgent. In this instance, he had 3 projects that he wanted us to back: assistance to political prisoners, support for a network of independent educational and cultural activities, and the journal Zeszyty Literackie. Jan knew that our support to the Solidarity Trade Union would be going through a separate channel managed by the American labor movement, so he wasn't telling me to do that. Of course, I did what Jan requested. I always did, because he was very insistent and he was always right. But it was also a mutual relationship. The NED was a new organization in the 1980s, and our budget was repeatedly challenged in the US Congress. And whenever we got into trouble, and that was often, all I had to do was to tell Jan that we needed help, and the Congress would be deluged with letters supporting NED from throughout the Polish-American community. He understood better than anyone that our struggle to survive was a critical dimension of the effort to bring democracy to Poland and other countries of the Soviet bloc. And so Jan and I became friends, comrades in arms, really. And on July 11th, 2002, just before Jan returned to Poland, we honored him with our Democracy Service Medal. And some of the people who are going to be on the program today, Paula Dobriansky, Nadia Duke, were with us when we had that wonderful ceremony. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Ryszard Schneff, who, as I said, requested that we do this event today and will be our host for lunch today. He's had a long career in the Polish diplomatic service since 1991, served a lot in Latin America, but what I picked out in his biography was that in 2005, he was entrusted with the position of plenipotentiary of the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the organization of the 25th anniversary commemorating the Solidarity Trade Union movement, which summoned high-level delegations to Poland from 28 different countries. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Ambassador Schneff.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning on that rainy day. I know it's not easy, so I'm very thankful for being with us today. I am delighted to welcome you to the conference devoted to Jan Nowak-Jeziorański's legacy. It's really great to be here at the nest of world democracy. Before I come to the point, allow me please to recognize a few personalities and special guests. I'm particularly honored to welcome Mr. Władysław Zachariasiewicz, I'm not sure whether he's here. He was supposed to be. I used to call Władysław, who just some couple of weeks ago, we together honored him with his 103 years birthday, a national treasure. I hope he will come and he feels good today. I also welcome cordially Dr. Zbigniew Brzeziński, whom I do not need to present here, the former National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, a founder of Brzezinski Institute on Geostrategy at the CSIS, the second best think tank of the world. Let me also welcome two gentlemen who arrived from Warsaw. Warsaw is still a little bit colder than Washington. It's a kind of escape, I understand. I welcome Andrzej Siezieniecki, President and CEO of the Polish Radio, and Andrzej Mietkowski, Director of the Polish Radio website from Warsaw as well. Andrzej, where are you? He disappeared for a moment. He will come back. Let me give special thanks to my friends who accepted the invitation to speak at today's panel. Former Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, Pola Dobriański. I understand the traffic is heavy today, so we are still waiting for a couple of guests. I'm sure, I know Pola, she will come. And let me welcome former US Ambassador to Poland, Dan Fried, a great friend of our country and my personal friend. And also author and chair of the Polish-American Freedom Foundation, Andrew Zagorski. Andrew, you're here. And Peter Pomerantsev, writer and TV producer. Last but not least, let me thank to our host, Karl Gershman, president of the National Endowment for Democracy, a friend of Poland, and the Polish Embassy, and also Martin Frost, chairman of the board of NED. Thank you all for hosting this event with us. I would like to thank also your staff for making it possible. Let me now turn a few words to Jan Nowak-Jeziorański, who manifested the best of Polish intellectual traditions, namely transparency and thoughtfulness. Jan once said, when trying to explain his life motivations, without us, no one would know what's going on in Poland. My work in the radio was the most fitting choice I could have made. Of course. And even today, I appreciate that. Radio Free Europe remains one of the most recognizable and strong brands in Poland, easily competing with Coca-Cola. How instrumental it was for Polish people and particularly intellectuals, we can all only imagine. But personally, I still remember my father kneeling in front of an old radio aga and fighting desperately with jammed frequencies. And then, of course, running to our neighbor, Henryk Krzeszkowski, later on a guru of the conservatives, who lived just aside, to share the latest news and discuss them thoroughly. The radio spoke frequently on the relations between the United States and Russia. Let me quote Jan Nowak. From the point of view of the United States, it is imperative to pursue such a policy regarding Russia as to change the imperialist mentality of Russian elites. How accurate it sounds today. Ladies and gentlemen, today you have a unique chance to recall our past and to travel into the future. You are about to embark on a fascinating and inspiring journey, and I wish you all to return from that trip more convinced that the world would be much better if there are more people like Jan Nowak-Jeziorański. Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Ned Board, Martin Frost, who for 13 terms represented the Dallas-Fort Worth district in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas. But more importantly, for the purposes of this morning's discussion, from 1990 to 1995, Martin chaired a special House task force established to help Eastern and Central European countries transition to democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I might note also that Martin, next month, Martin is the author of an important book that's going to be published co-authored with Tom Davis about the partisan divide in our own Congress. He's given great leadership to the NED, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Martin Frost.
I realize that I'm superficial, which made me very happy. Do you have a copy?
Well, thank you, Carl. I'm pleased to welcome you to this event honoring and celebrating the centenary of the birth of Jan Nowak. Jan's life reads like a modern-day thriller, except in this case the hero was not fictional, but very real. And fortunately for all of us, he became a very trusted advisor in the early days of the endowment, as Carl has spelled out. You will hear more about Jan from those who knew him best, and you will hear him in his own powerful voice. Of course, in paying tribute to Jan, we also honor the country he loved and cared about so much, both its triumph over the 20th century great horrors, Nazism and communism, and its success in establishing a strong and independent democracy. It is widely accepted that the transformation in Central and Eastern Europe started in Poland. As the Iron Curtain began to crumble in the fall of 1989, the U.S. Senate adopted a resolution to provide a gift of democracy to the new Polish parliament. The following June, I was asked by then Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, where I served for 13 terms, to lead an effort to provide support to the newly established democratic parliaments in Central and Eastern Europe. From 1990 to 1996, the Frost-Solomon Task Force partnered with the parliaments of 12 countries in the region. The task force final report was issued in 1998, noting a lasting positive impact of the democratic work of parliaments in each of the 12 countries. I was pleased to be in attendance 4 years ago in Warsaw when the Polish Senate and Sejm hosted a commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the creation of the House Task Force. As chairman of the endowment, I am once again honored to play a role in helping men and women all over the world realize their dreams of living in free and democratic societies. Jan Nowak's life and work can serve as a model both for us and for them of what can be achieved through determination and courage. Let me congratulate and thank the Embassy of Poland and NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies for putting together this important event today. Thank you.
Before we hear from Dr. Brzezinski, we wanted to actually hear from Jan himself. And the Holocaust Museum sent us a copy of an interview that it conducted with Jan in 1995. It's part of the oral history program of the Holocaust Museum. There are flyers outside, which I'll mention later, about their desire to continue to receive materials and information for people who had direct contact with people who were suffered during the Holocaust. In any event, Jan, they shared this with us, this interview, and the following excerpt that we're going to play for you now highlights Jan's dramatic role as an emissary from the Polish underground to London, beginning in December 1943. He wrote a book, of course, Courier from Warsaw, and he was trying to warn government officials in Britain at the highest levels, Anthony Eden, you'll hear about that, and Winston Churchill, about the threats faced by Poland from both the Germans and the Russians, as well as the desperate situation facing European Jewry. Jan Karski were probably the two people who did the most to try to alert the world to the Holocaust during the Second World War. So we'll now show the short video. Thank you.
Oops. Pardon me. Can you turn the sound, please? Try now.
On 11th of December 43. And I left on, I believe, 14th of July, or maybe on 11th of July, 44. And I reached Poland on 25th of July, just before the Warsaw Uprising. And I was sent after the collapse of the uprising back. And we reached, it was a long journey. We reached London on 22nd of January 45. This was the last trip.
Your first trip to London, why were you sent there? What was your role? What was your sense?
Emissary, the men who were bringing some very important messages, oral, briefing. I had a mission. And also, of course, I had my microfilms with me. But they were important reports from the commander-in-chief in Poland to the Polish commander-in-chief in London and to the Polish government. And my main mission was to brief and to tell people. I mean, I met Anthony Eden, I met at least 5 other members of the war cabinet. It was Ernest Bevin, Archibald Singler, who was the Minister of the Air Force, Lord Selborne, Psychological Warfare, Morrison. Ernest Bevin was Labour. And at the end I met Churchill. This was my last meeting. I met many parliamentarians, many journalists.
What kind of information were you taking to London?
About the underground activities, about the situation there, about our plans of action, and above all, we were trying to really get support in view of the coming danger from the Soviets. I mean, it was not only fight against the Germans, we were then already facing great danger of the Russians, of the Soviets. And my mission was really to convince the British and the Americans that they should in some way help us to resist Soviet designs to subjugate Poland and the rest of the area. This was one of my most important missions. And one of my missions was also to report about genocide of Jews. This was a high priority mission. I got instructions to consider it a very high priority.
Now, when you met with Mr. Eden and some of these other ministers, what kind of response did you get from them?
Well, it was friendly. There was interest because it was unusual to have an emissary from occupied country. And at the same time, the attitude, well, what can we do for you? Do you want us to make a war with Russia to defend Poland? How can we help you? I was right in the middle of the game between Joseph Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, with the Poland in the middle, and I was trying to use this influence. I also was telling everybody I could about the genocide, about the Holocaust, and I believe when I talked to the Jews from Joint organization, with some rabbi from New York, I was in the presence of Ignacy Schwarzbart, who was a Polish Zionist, an important political figure. I sensed that they don't believe me. And only one high-level British intelligence officer who was really moved by my story about the Jews. And he told me, and I was told the same story by Ignacy Schwarzbart. Don't tell people that 2.5 million Jews were killed. Nobody is going to believe you. It's something beyond imagination. They will say, you exaggerate. Tell the individual stories. Tell what you saw. Use examples. But don't use statistics, because they will not believe you. And I was trying to use it. But when I and my wife, after the war, in 1976, when I was writing my war memoirs, we both went to London, to the archives, to Her Majesty's Record Office. Plenty of documents were already declassified. And I found a lot of documents concerning myself, the report that Anthony Eden wrote after meeting me, addressed to Churchill. In all these reports, nothing about what I said about the Jews. Not one word. I spoke to the intelligence officers. I spoke to Eden, to others. In all their reporting, any reference to the Jews were not repeated. And then I was interested to find if the same story was with Jan Karski, who was 1 year before me. And I found a report of Anthony Eden on his conversation with Karski in the documents of the British War Cabinet. It was printed and distributed. Not one word about the Jews. So I sent it to Karski. And he wrote me back saying, look, I told Eden, when I was describing the situation in Poland, I told about what's going on with the Jews. Not one word. Not one word. And the main reason, I think, you had to differentiate between two categories of people. There were people who simply didn't believe because this was something beyond their imagination. And there were Jews. Jews from the United States I talked to, and British Jews, simply didn't believe. They didn't believe that there is a possibility of mass killing in a sort of conveyor belt method, like in a factory or in a butchery. You just mechanically kill people one after the other. They didn't believe it. And they were suspecting me of some kind of ulterior motives. They said, well, why a Pole should exaggerate? Well, because he's anti-German, and he would like to have as harsh terms imposed on the Germans after their defeat as possible. That's why he's exaggerating. And they were, but as far as such people as Eden is concerned, or members of the cabinet, they were very well informed. Because discovered it after the war that, for instance, a very high-level Nazi official, whose name is known, was passing to a Polish intelligence officer in Bern, in Switzerland, information about the plans of final solution, well before they started to implement it. And I know that this report was passed on to British and to Americans. They knew, but they didn't, they were afraid that if this war become known publicly, it will generate the pressure from the Jewish communities and general public for some kind of action that would divert limited military resources from the military targets to the targets that are, in their view, irrelevant from the military point of view. And that may prolong the war. I don't remember if it was Eden or Bevin, Ernest Bevin, who said, well, the only way we can really save the Jews is to win the war. And the more we can focus on military targets, strategic military targets, the better to the Jews. We cannot, I think they refused to bomb the railway track to Auschwitz because they believed that they would be repaired in a matter of days or hours, but the planes may be lost. The planes which could be used to bomb the important target in Germany would be diverted from the target. And they were wrong, because the greatest tragedy of Jews was not just their death, indifference of the world. That they were absolutely lonely in the face of their death. It was they realized, well, the world doesn't care about the methods we are killed, about this dimension of the crime. We are lonely. You see, and this was, in my view, it was a crime really, not to do something. As a kind of a moral relief, that we tried to do something to save you, you know.
Well, those of you who didn't know Jan got a glimpse of him there, and I have to say that when I began to work with Jan, I didn't really know all of that, but you know, you saw the passion, the strategic intelligence as well, just extraordinary. We're really absolutely delighted this morning to be able to open the formal program with our dear friend and former board member, Zbig, Dr. Brzezinski. He was a member of the NED board for 9 years. He was tough on us. He always raised the right questions, though, and I think when he left the board, the staff, you know, really missed him because. But it was terrific, and he stayed involved with us since. We had a memorial service here in 2006 for Anna Politkovskaya, and Zbig spoke beautifully. And again, when Bronislaw Geremek passed, Zbig spoke at the memorial meeting. We've had events here, especially on Chechnya, where Zbig has worked very, very closely with us in supporting Ilya Sakhmadov. We had an event about his memoir that appeared, and then later a book that he did of the wartime cables that he received, tapes that he received from Aslan Maskhadov, president, giving a history of the Chechen War. So we've worked really, we've continued to work with Zbig and consider him to be a great friend. We want to open this morning with Zbig giving some of his personal reflections about Jan. We'll have a little bit of time for a little bit of Q&A before we go to the panel. But you know, I know how close Zbig and Jan were, and I know that we're all looking forward to hearing his thoughts about Jan on this occasion of celebrating Jan's centenary. Zbig.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's very nice to be here. I always feel in this gathering very much at home. Before talking about Jan, let me make a comment about what we have just heard, because that was such a powerful statement. And it made me think of what, in my judgment, is the greatest failure of those who didn't do anything about the Holocaust. It isn't really the issue of what could have been done militarily. Because, in fact, I think the Brits and the Americans who said we can't do very much, we have to win this war. Because what can we do? Bomb the railway tracks? Well, they'll be repaired. They can kill the Jews and so forth. What struck me about that comment was the total silence of the West. That's what really struck me. There was not much being said about it. I lived every day of that war, watching it from afar, but I was almost there. I was so passionately engaged in it. And there was total silence. Total silence. Kind of disbelief. Disbelief. And this is what Karski experienced himself when he talked to Roosevelt and then to Frankfurter. They just couldn't imagine it. There should have been at least a moral reaction and a warning to the Nazis and others that they'll be punished and that this will live in infamy. And this is, I think, the greatest moral failure. There was a rush to win the war, and that's understandable. But silence, I think, is inexcusable. But anyway, that's my own reaction after hearing that very powerful statement by Jan. Well, you all saw Jan on the screen. Committed, thoughtful, dedicated. I met him for the first time in 1953. I had just obtained my degree, and I was on a trip to Europe, and as part of it, I went to Munich, where Radio Free Europe was stationed, and I asked to see him. He was actually reluctant to see me, because I was just a nobody. And to me, he was a hero. I knew about him. But fortunately, working at CIA, undercover, of course, was an American who was with the CIA. And he knew of my serious interests in the Soviet Union. And he knew a little bit about what I thought ought to be done about the Soviet Union. And he told Jan that it wouldn't be a waste of his time to receive me. So we went for a quick lunch, which lasted about 2 hours. And after that, our friendship lasted almost 50 years. And it grew steadily, it didn't immediately break out into a complete friendship. But Jan, in his memoirs, writes about his impressions of me, and I was, of course, overwhelmed by this hero, this person who fought in the underground, who parachuted into Poland, occupied Poland, who with his wife marched out of burned down and destroyed Warsaw with the task of delivering microfilms, as he said, to the government in London. And he had to make his way through Germany, then into Switzerland, and then into already the partially liberated parts of France and so forth, and got to London. This was a person who immediately impressed you with the strength of his character, the strength of his convictions, and his really acute intelligence. I mean, he was a formidable person, one of the most impressive I have known in my life. What can I say about him more generally? Well, first of all, he was the authentic voice of freedom for several decades to a country that was occupied and was being brainwashed by a false ideology, whose spirit of resistance, which was so vibrant against the Nazis, was partially crushed and partially still vibrant, but in a hopeless way, because there was no way of winning. But some people still were willing to give their lives in a sporadic resistance. This was the voice of freedom, but also a very realistic voice. And that came across most strongly during the Hungarian Revolution, but even before that. Jan advocated freedom and urged them to be steadfast in their desire for freedom. But at the same time, he told the Poles, talking from the outside, don't do anything rash, don't do anything crazy. There were all sorts of underground movements that wanted to do this and that, or get themselves ready to spring forth if a war breaks out between America and the Soviet Union. And Jan was saying, there's going to be no such war. And just be patient, consolidate, retain what identifies you, what defines you. Don't let that be eroded. But don't do acts of desperation. For example, the difference between the Hungarians and the Poles in '56 was very much a byproduct of Jan's advocacy from the outside. The Hungarians rose heroically and were crushed, and their leaders were subsequently hanged. The Poles, with Jan's support, rallied around a communist, Gomulka, who chose to defy the Soviets in the name of independence of Poland, but as a communist country. And Jan, in effect, urged the Poles to support this communist new leader who emerged from Stalinist prisons, which were then being opened, and became suddenly the first secretary of the party. The Poles stood behind Gomulka and defied Khrushchev, and the Russians didn't crush Poland because they knew that the international ramifications might be complicated. And they knew also not only that you can't predict how the West will react, and the Chinese were already making noises then. Let them be. If they want to be Polish communists, let them be, and that helped enormously. So he was a realist. In addition to that, as the years unfolded, and as we exchanged more and more communications with each other, he became an extremely articulate supporter of the kind of doctrine that I tried to formulate openly as the policy for the West. At that time, the choices in the West were liberation, quote unquote, Dulles, President Eisenhower, a policy which became visibly empty in 1956, or containment, which was essentially a static policy, the famous Kennan policy. Static, let wait for developments. I was advocating peaceful engagement, namely, engage with the East, find openings for contacts, encourage them to have more contacts with us, play on national differences. And increasingly, that became the voice of Radio Free Europe. He adopted that totally and had me come over and speak to that subject many times. And he became himself a much more forceful exponent of it than I. He also fought for the survival of Radio Free Europe. Everyone now praises Radio Free Europe, but some very important American political figures, including on the Democratic side, not just some kind of detached from reality Republicans who just didn't believe in this kind of stuff, but some Democrats, very distinguished Senator Fulbright, were in favor of cutting its funds drastically and then eliminating it. He fought against that vigorously and tried to mobilize support in the West for it. And he and I continued exchanging views on this subject throughout all these years. In fact, someone has recently collated the exchange of letters between us and has published them as a book in Poland, and it simply reproduces 386 letters between us. Most of them are really substantive letters, including these conflicts and strategic visions and opportunities and so forth. He, of course, moved to America later on when he ended his service in Washington and moved to D.C. And I was able to give him the position of consultant to the National Security Council staff. And that gave him a certain kind of access to the U.S. government. And he exercised that access to the hilt. Dan Fried, who sits right here, probably recalls his relentless efforts to infuse a kind of vision in American policy which would be effective in helping Poland recover its independence and then consolidate that independence when it came to be. That led then in turn to its next big role, namely the mobilization of the Polish-American community in favor of NATO expansion, which would include Poland. Mr. Zacharasiewicz, who just arrived here, our venerable 103 years old colleague, was very much involved with that, and so was, of course, very much Novak, who really bombarded everyone he could with appeals and messages, not so subtle hints of electoral consequences if it doesn't happen, and of course letters and conferences and phone calls to various members of the administration. That was his life. That was his entire life. He lived that way. He was simultaneously a Polish patriot and then a devoted American. He became an American citizen. I couldn't have made him a member of the sort of associated staff of the NSC if he wasn't an American citizen. So he combined both ambitions, both identities into one. But he was a person of really great personal strength, courage, physical courage, and intellectual courage. And that combination is not frequent. One is often one or the other, but the two together is quite unique. He, in my judgment, and here I tread on somewhat dangerous territory, his only misjudgment, in my opinion, came towards the end. Namely, his wife was just like him, dedicated, fearless. She participated, for example, in that mission from destroyed Warsaw through Germany, masquerading and all that, dangerous as hell. And she was a fighter. She did not want to return to Poland. Jan returned to Poland for a brief visit immediately after Solidarity took power. And was greeted as a hero, deservedly so. But he had to come back to America because his wife was not well. He had to take care of her. They were faithful to each other. And he stayed in America until she died early in the 21st century. Only then did he return to Poland. My view is that had he returned to Poland shortly after liberation, he would have played directly and personally a very important political role, because he was a hero. He was from America, which at that time meant something to the Poles. It still does, but then it was an emotional outburst of solidarity with America. If he had wished, I think, maybe not have become president, because Wałęsa, Mazowiecki, the leaders of the Solidarity, had to be acknowledged, and it would have been unwise to have some semi-foreigner, so to speak, as top leader, but certainly as an energetic prime minister. He would have been more directly involved. He continued to be involved indirectly when he came back to Poland by advising, speaking up courageously, voicing opinions, but it was not a role in which he found total satisfaction, because he also in that context became conscious of some shortcomings, political intrigues, the inevitable degradations of political life after a moment of ecstatic emancipation. Nonetheless, he and the Pope were then in Poland the two most important voices. And I'll always remember him as a friend, as a person who I first greatly admired, who then became a colleague and a partner in a great enterprise, of which some participants are present here today, and of which NAD is a symbol of American engagement.
Thank you, Zbig. I recently was speaking with a young Polish friend who's working in Korea now on North Korea. And when I told her we were doing this event, she was very excited about it. And I, for some reason, because I knew Jan here, I didn't know how well known he was in Poland. And she said to me, every school child in Poland knows about Jan. How did that happen? Was it because of the broadcasting? Was it because of the reputation Jan had from being an emissary during the war?
Well, the latter helped. The latter helped, but of course the radio was the reason why they knew him. This was the window to the world for, millions of Poles who in the dead of the night, in spite of radio jamming, would play with these rather primitive radios and try to catch and then listen to him. And he was an authentic voice with increasing authority. And while the name he used was an assumed name, which he assumed in the course of his underground activities, it became very clearly and quickly known to most Poles that he was also an underground hero who participated physically in the struggle on the ground. Because when he came to Poland just before the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He, of course, immediately became part of the underground. And during the 63-day struggle of Poland, of the Poles that rose in Warsaw, seized Warsaw from the Nazis, and then Stalin simply sat on the sidelines and watched the Nazis crush them, he became the head of the radio that was broadcasting from Warsaw to the world, telling the world what is happening in Poland, appealing for help, asserting Polish independence, alerting the world to what was happening.
After Jan left here, I said we gave him a service medal, and right before he left, in July of 2002, he returned. And what he did in the last years of his life is interesting and I think is relevant today, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this. He started a center in Wrocław, parallel to another center that existed for relations with the East. He believed that Wrocław was a city whose citizens, and this I'm quoting Jan, have their roots above all in the East, and is therefore a natural place of meeting for Poles, Ukrainians, Poles and Russians, Belarusians and Lithuanians. And the result was the founding of the Collegium of Eastern Europe in February of, actually was set up just before Jan returned in February of 2001, with the mission of building bridges and trust between the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. And Jan's archive is in the Ossolenium, which is the Collegium's academic counterpart, and Jan was made an honorary citizen of Wrocław, which he called a strategic outpost. Jan was always strategic, a strategic outpost in the struggle for a better and safer future for Poland. And obviously one of the critical things here was Poland's relationship with Ukraine and trying to build that solidarity. Now we're in a very, very dangerous moment regarding that. And what really needs to be done today to try to secure stability in that part of the world, which is so very dangerous. We have with us this morning one of our speakers, Peter Pomerantsev, who's got a book reviewed in the Wall Street Journal today about the whole Russian propaganda system and the kind of people who are running the country, the weaponization of information. I know how concerned Jan would be about this. What has to be done today to try to establish stability in that very dangerous part of the world?
I know the outfit you mentioned in Wrocław very well, because I was involved marginally in his decision to put his archive there. And very recently, I was actually honored by them by being given some sort of a reward, and I'm well informed of their activities. I think his notion, of course, would be that we should be doing now some of the things that were being done during the Cold War and in which he so actively participated. Namely, we ought to be making a massive effort to address, first of all, people in Russia regarding the issues involved, because these issues pertain to their future, first of all. Do they really understand what Putin is doing? Do they fully appreciate the risks he is imposing on them? Do they sense the dangers that are implicit in what he is doing? Do they really want to be eventually a vassal of China by becoming so totally isolated? These are the kind of issues which should be drummed into their heads day after day by a massive campaign. The Central Europeans don't need that anymore. They are part of the West. They are much more worried about what we will do or not do. That's, I think, a different issue. I suspect, and now I speak a little bit maybe inappropriately, but I suspect he would be sharing my view, which is that we have to be clear-cut and steadfast in our support for the Ukrainians. We should be willing, if there is a resumption of violence, and the violence is clearly a product of Russia, because it wouldn't be possible without Russian support for it, or even participation. that if that happens, we would have no choice to give defensive weaponry to the Ukrainians. I emphasize the word defensive, but I also know what the word weaponry means. It has to be something that is effective, and I have been on the record as saying we should provide such weaponry, particularly defensive weaponry for city fighting, for urban resistance. Because there's no point in Putin sending hundreds of tanks across the fields of Ukraine. It doesn't decide anything. But if he takes first Kharkiv and then Kiev, and he boasted to a Western European leader that he could take Kiev in 3 days, if he discovered that his troops have to take cities, house-to-house fighting, like the one that Novak experienced, 63 days, 20,000 underground soldiers, kids, armed with revolvers and rifles at most. And yet the Nazis had to fight through house and house, through window and window. That takes time. When the Russians tried to take Grozny, and they said they would take it in 3 hours, it ended up 3 months, because Grozny resisted. Urban fighting is uniquely difficult to overcome if you give the people the right weapons. I would favor that. At the same time, I've also said, and that is of some controversy, and I think probably Jan Nowak would understand and be with me, but I don't postulate this categorically, and he's in no position to confirm and to deny. But I have said publicly that I think we should also make it clear to the Russians that if they become realistic and desist from the kind of efforts to undermine Ukraine from within, so that Ukraine becomes a permanent economic failure, and they have the capacity to do that without even marching on Kiev, then in return for that, we would respect their sensitivity about the desire of some Ukrainians to be a member of NATO, and that this would not happen, that we would then aim to perpetuate and formalize some arrangement which would place Ukraine in the same position as Finland. Just consider this. Finland fought a war against the Soviet Union on the side of the Nazis, but for its own reasons. The Russians realized they didn't want another war with Finland in 45, so they didn't pursue it. Subsequently, when Europe began to emerge and NATO began to emerge, Finland did not become a member of NATO, but has become a member very actively of all other European Western institutions. And it's implicitly understood that we wouldn't be indifferent, the Swedes wouldn't be indifferent if the Russians moved against Finland. That kind of status for Ukraine is perhaps part of a framework of joint accommodation, which in different ways Ukraine needs, because otherwise it will become an economic wreck, which the West needs, because if it lasts too long, there's always the risk that the West will begin to fragment, that some will say, oh, it's too much of a risk, we'll disassociate ourselves from the sanctions. Some European countries are saying that. And it will be of enormous and unpredictable cost to Russia, with, in my judgment, inevitable weakening of Russia's economy and self-assurance and dependence on China. So I think there are some realistic options along these lines, just as peaceful engagement towards the Soviet bloc was the way to undermine the Soviet bloc while being peaceful and constructive in doing it. And that was its undeniable charm and eventual success. And I suspect Jan would look at it the same way.
You know, we have a few minutes left, and it wouldn't surprise me if somebody in the audience had a question. I have questions about that, but I'll open it up before I pose mine. Is that a hand there? Yeah, go ahead. Get a mic and...
Thank you. Dr. Brzezinski, recently I interviewed in New York Ilyas Akhmadov on his new book, and he said that qualifying the struggle of Chechens as separatism is wrong, because he said, quote, "We are fighting for what is rightfully ours." And what is your opinion on that? And also, how long do you think the Kremlin will be able to control the ethnic entities in Russia?
Well, in the case of Hungary, it's a kind of idiosyncratic development connected with the personality of the leader and some extremist tendencies in Hungarian politics, which have been living and influencing the Hungarian world outlook since the Trianon Treaty. Because the Trianon Treaty, right after World War I, inflicted the most severe territorial punishment, not in Germany, although Germany was severely punished, or Austria, which was unpunished at all, but massively so in Hungary. So there is a kind of a sense of injustice in the Hungarian outlook to the world, which then leads to certain somewhat bizarre manifestations, such as those which are now prevailing in Budapest. But by and large, the core of Central Europe, the Baltic states, are vigorous. The Lithuanians are doing more for Ukraine in some areas, and I don't want to specify which, than we. The Poles are certainly for the Ukrainians. The Romanians are for the Ukrainians. So I think the sort of basic weight of Central Europe is still solid in spite of these variations in the opposite direction. There's someone back there.
Okay, is there one?
Yes, over there.
Okay, maybe we'll take that question. Thank you.
Here it goes. Good morning, Mr. Gershwin, Dr. Brzezinski. I'm Asta Bononis with the Lithuanian American Community Incorporated. I worked at Radio Free Europe for 10 years, but I had the great privilege of being on a committee with Jan, where we were arguing for NATO enlargement. It was the Central and Eastern European Coalition, and he was such a warm and, as you say, intellectually courageous. Dr. Brzezinski, you said that. I totally agree. And the ultimate gentleman. He always made us slightly younger people feel at home and that our ideas were valued. Now, I'm going to disagree with you. I'm frankly shocked about your comment about Ukraine and NATO, because I'm glad the Obama administration so far hasn't listened to you, if this really is your position, that there should be a deal made over the heads of the Ukrainians, who are spilling their blood right now for their national identity and their survival. And if they have come to an understanding that they want to be not a neutral zone, some kind of a gray zone, like we had between World War I and World War II, then why shouldn't they be coming into NATO?
I think the answer is very simple. First of all, to be a member of NATO, there has to be an overwhelming desire to be in NATO. That is not the case with the Ukrainian public. If you look at the public opinion polls, the country is quite split on that. Until recently, the majority even after the fighting started, was against entry. Now there has been a shift towards the majority favoring being in NATO. But there's still an extremely substantial opposition to being a member of NATO within Ukraine itself. So first of all, that would split the Ukrainian outlook. The second very important point is that to be a member of NATO, you have to be an established democracy and an effective democracy. You can't say that Ukraine is that right now. Thirdly, membership in NATO is not a right that anyone just asserts. It's a privilege that's granted by NATO to the country concerned, because the alliance itself makes a collective decision that this strengthens the security of everyone. Now, that is a very important point, because if you look at the map and you imagine Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, and if you see how far Ukraine extends into the southern parts above the frontier of Russia, it kind of indents all the way practically to Stalingrad. You can see why the Russians will view that as an extraordinary expansion of Western, in particular American, strategic influence over Russia. And those sentiments cannot be ignored. This is an important country. It is in our interest to draw it eventually towards the West, to become in some fashion a part of the West. rather than increasingly to press it through the expansion of a military alliance, which they could only then interpret as directed against them. And because Ukraine is an important and big country, that would have a far more dangerous effect and impact on Russia than if earlier on that had been done with Finland. I doubt very much that the Russian-Finnish relationship would be as relatively stable and calm as it has been for 50 years if in some fashion we had insisted in the 40s that Finland be part of NATO. The Finns today would probably be faced with the same kind of provocations and difficulties that the Baltic countries have been facing. I fully support the membership of the Baltic countries because prior to that they had been incorporated in the Soviet Union and they have no capacity to stand up on their own. The Finns, because of the geographic location, do. And they know, and the Russians know, and we know, that if they were pushed and attacked, they wouldn't be alone. The situation, therefore, is very, very different from the problem of Ukraine. The problem of Ukraine ultimately raises the problem of the long-range relationship with Russia as well. And we cannot ignore the fact that in the longer run, it's in our interest to draw Russia to the West and not to antagonize it by making it fearful that our expansion, military expansion, is designed against them. And then the final point, membership is a privilege. It's not a right. A country has to earn it. So even if one were to adopt it for the time being, there could always be the possibility of that being changed if the Russians remain very aggressive and so forth. But first, Ukraine would have to prove that it has met all of the qualifications that are necessary for membership. So I would say, if we want this issue to be solved peacefully right now, it is one of the elements of a quid pro quo with the Russians. If we want the Russians in return, for example, to recognize the pre-existing frontiers of Ukraine. Otherwise, what is our policy? Is it to force the Russians to all of a sudden say, we capitulate, we give up, we made a stupid mistake and we apologize and we pull back? How realistic is that? What was interesting about Novak, he was always very realistic.
Well, I'm not the least bit surprised that our discussion with Zvig this morning would be a brilliant introduction to our panel, which is going to follow, the title of which we gave to it, because we wanted to be talking not just looking backwards, but looking to the future, new threats to security and democracy in Europe. And I think Jan would really love this discussion. And thank you so much, Zvig. It was terrific. So, well, we're going to start, I think. Yeah.
It's on now. Yep. Hi, how are you?
Okay, we will do
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Yeah, I just turned it on. Okay.
Okay. Mine is on.
Everybody, everybody suitably mic'd up, and Peter now has his turned on. Thank you. Yes, we didn't want to hear from you too soon, but
I'm not going to live this one down, am I?
I think we would like to get started with our next panel. As Carl promised, we have a very interesting panel for you here to follow up on the excellent remarks of Dr. Brzezinski and also the very moving film clip from the Holocaust Museum. So when we were thinking through how to put this event together, and we knew that we wanted a panel, we were looking for a conceptist to put together a panel that's something that would bring us into the present day, but would also be a worthy tribute to celebrate Jan Nowak's 100th birthday. But it soon became obvious what the themes should be. The topics that Jan pursued and advocated for during his lifetime are still just as relevant today as they were then. And in fact, I'm sure that if he were sitting here with us now, he would be urging us towards some line of action or other. I noticed that word urgency this morning came up a couple of times, and I'm sure that Jan would be here arguing his point and being very vigorous on all of the issues. So we've picked out three themes that are very obvious, ones that Jan pursued passionately. He was devoted to supporting Poland's path to freedom and democracy right up to NATO accession. He was interested in the geopolitical situation, Poland's eastern neighborhood, as has been mentioned this morning, and the course of democracy in Ukraine and Russia. And also, as the quintessential courier who carried information during the Second World War, he was passionate about a free press, media, and the importance of the flow of information for free societies. And also, he was very aware of how information can be used to manipulate and coerce. So, to help us explore these areas, we have four real experts here with us today. You have the bios in your program, but I'll just mention a couple as I introduce them, I'll mention a couple of things about them. Dan Fried seems to have held every position relevant to Poland and Eastern Europe that there has been in the US government, even though right now, when he first took his position as sanctions, the coordinator for sanctions policy in January 2013, he probably thought he was getting a rest from Eastern Europe, but not so. So he joins us today, and as you will note, he was ambassador to Poland from November 1997 until May 2000. Andrew Nagorski is a journalist, author, foreign correspondent, editor, most notably bureau chief for the Warsaw office, and most notoriously bureau chief in Moscow, from where he was unceremoniously thrown out in 1982, which is actually, you two might want to swap notes on that, because I can see something coming future for Peter here. Andy, we have a generational thing going on here too. Andy is also the author of some books which are very well worth a read. In the past, he wrote Reluctant Farewell about those experiences, The Birth of Freedom about Eastern Europe, and more recently, Hitlerland, which I have not read myself, but maybe some of those insights that you found on the rise of fascism in Germany might be relevant to our discussion today. Paula is a senior fellow with the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard University, and also the chair of National Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of America. She also held a very long tenure as Under Secretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs at the State Department. But I think here we consider the tenure that she held here at the NED as a member of the Board of Directors as maybe more important than that to us. And for 9 years, she was a very key and important board member here at the NED. Peter Pomerantsev is an incisive analyst of Russia's media. He's an author, documentary producer, and recently published his book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which he is now vigorously promoting here in the United States. So we expect to hear his contribution on some of those subjects in a while. I'm going to pose questions, and then we'll see how we go. I know that Paula has to leave a little early, but I think we'll probably get to you before then. So Dan, you were Poland desk officer in the late 1980s when Ned was doing a lot of work to support Solidarity, so you must have had many discussions with Jan about how that support should proceed and where he imagined it would take Poland. And you were also very much on the inside during Poland's accession to NATO as ambassador when all of that took place. So please share with us some of your reflections about those events. What can we learn from Poland's experiences? And should Poland feel secure in the current environment?
I worked with Jan Nowak during two distinct periods of recent Polish and European history, and on two tasks. One was the 87 to 89 period, starting with Jaruzelski's famous referendum, which launched the period of cautious probing between Solidarity and the government, which ended in the roundtable talks, and then the remarkable achievement of Polish freedom. And the second period was 93 to 97, when I was at the NSC in the Clinton administration, when we, that is the Clinton administration and a group of strong, active Republicans helping, including Paula Gabriansky, were designing what turned out to be the foundations of the post-Cold War world. So this was the achievement of Poland's freedom and the consolidation of that freedom in a wider context of European security. And I'll go back to what Zbigniew Brzezinski said about Jan. He was supremely realistic about what could be accomplished in any given situation with the resources at hand. But he did not give in to the, I'm about to editorialize, pernicious doctrine of realism, under which Poland's freedom would never have been achieved and we never would have supported it. There's a crucial distinction, and he made it. Realism means, as an operational cautionary note, means not telling the Hungarians to revolt when you're not going to support them. And it means, as Big said, telling the Poles to get what they could under the circumstances that they actually faced in the real world. But it also meant never forgetting what it was you started out to do. And Jan Nowak had, for all of us, the tremendous moral authority of an active officer of the free Polish government who was serving his home country and his adopted country at the same time without conflict. So he tied his idealism to realism on the ground, and he was supremely prepared for what happened in 1989. Far more so than the generation of academics, Zbigniew Brzezinski aside, who trained my generation and Andy Nagurski to accept the Cold War lines as immutable and inevitable. That's what we were taught, and we were taught that freedom for Eastern Europe was no more than a slogan to be trotted out on Captive Nations Week. And ethnic Americans, Polish Americans, were to be patronized and pandered to without being taken seriously. I'm being rough, but deliberately so to illustrate the point. Jan Nowak was serious, both in his tactical realism and his strategic vision. For him, communism was not mandated by heaven and regarded to be the end of Polish history. It was a historical reality that could be undone. And he inspired us, and in me personally, every day to think of that. And remember what it was the United States had been trying to achieve in the beginning of World War II with the Atlantic Charter, which we could not have achieved at the time because of our relative weakness in the 1930s, but which we did not forget and for which we were prepared during both of those periods. Now, that's a long answer, but I had a lot to say. Finally, one other point. This tie, it's pretty nice. It is a tie from the Polish EU presidency. Okay? A lot of very good history had to happen to make this tie symbolic of something real rather than a Jacek Fedorovich satire. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, I'll explain later. Jacek Fedorovich. Jan Nowak made that history happen. He was one of the people who took something like this tie and took it from a Jacek Fedorovich political cabaret joke from the 80s and made it reality, so that for the younger generation of American Foreign Service officers going to Embassy Warsaw, that's just taken for granted. Well, or it was until Ukraine, but I'll get into that later.
Okay, I actually remember when you and I first met, you were actually the Poland desk officer in the late 80s.
1987.
Bringing back memories.
The 90s,
yeah. Andy, you also have followed events in this part of the world very closely for many years. What would you say about what are the challenges that lie ahead for Poland and the broader neighborhood?
Thanks, Nadia. First of all, before I get to that question, I should say I think Jan would have particularly liked the fact that this event is bringing so many of us together here in the audience and here on the stage who knew each other throughout this and were involved in one way or another in various capacities.
Actually, I think the first time I met you, it was in one of these seedy in-tourist hotels in Lithuania in February of 1989, and we both knew something was going to happen in Lithuania, and that was I'm just reminding you, I think it was in the bar.
Yeah. I'm sure it wasn't in the bar. Yeah. Foreign correspondents never visit bars.
Oh.
So, and I also should say, just a personal note about Jan. I think I can claim the longest family history involvement with Jan, longer than Zbig, in the sense, by extension, of my parents, because my parents, who were approximately the same generation, knew Jan before the war. And my mother reminded me, my mother who's still alive, reminded me last night that when she was in high school in Warsaw, Jan, who was a couple years older, he was in Mickiewicz, which is a boys' high school. She was in Słowackiego, a girls' high school. And they would have what we would call, in our generation's age, I know it no longer exists, mixers, evening mix. And she met Jan in high school and got to know him. He met my dad later, but my dad, who later also ended up in the States, contributed to Radio Free Europe, and was, those of you who know him, several of you do, who knew him in those days, was also, like Jan, let's say, a strong-willed personality. And they would have their love, battles, hate. It was all in good. They would have very strong disagreements on things. And Jan, who, with all his other virtues, had a great sense of humor and loved to needle people, would say, "Well, I knew Marisha, my mother, long before you did." And he would pull that card out very often. So anyway, and then so when I was growing up, Jan was in and out of a presence in our lives, and even before I realized what his real role had been during the war, and in the early 90s, when I was based in Warsaw for Newsweek, Jan, when he started coming back, initially our house was the place he would stop on his trips in before he made a more frequent, a more regular arrangement. And it was amazing to watch him going from the person we knew from Munich and Washington to this sort of this an instant statesman in Warsaw, and everybody clamoring to see him, to interview him, and you began to recognize that it was such a sense of accomplishment. But he didn't stop there, as everyone has pointed out. He really was such a driving force for NATO, for NATO, but also the EU. Your tie here is very, very important. I was in Warsaw last week, and I was speaking to Jerzy Koźmiński, the former U.S. ambassador here, and Jerzy was reminding me that in '96, he and Jan were in Congress, in the Senate gallery, watching the vote on NATO expansion, and it was 80 to 19, and Jan was practically in tears when that was voted through. And then, but also very significantly, in 2003, when Poland had its referendum on the EU, there was concern about turnout. You had to have at least 50% turnout, which was not a given. It was a 2-day referendum. And the first day, the turnout, I think someone told me, was around 20%. I can't remember exactly, but it was not that great. And so Jan, who had been in the hospital, had various ailments at the time, made sure that he was wheeled in at 6 a.m. when the polls opened the following day to cast his vote yes, to send the message it is important that all Poles not only express their support mentally for the EU, but actually go out and vote. So all of these things mattered a tremendous amount, and the results again. When I was in transit in Paris on Tuesday, and I picked up Le Monde, front page story on Donald Tusk becoming the president of the European Council, and saying the conclusion of the story was that Poland is one of the countries that really counts in Europe. Jan would have loved that, and it's true. And you only have to go back to say something. I'm always reminded, one of my favorite authors about Europe in the 80s was Luigi Barzini, the Italian author. He wrote this wonderful book called The Europeans. And there were chapters about the French, the Germans, and everybody else, including a chapter about the baffling Americans, as he called them. But then there was not a word about Poland and the rest of of Europe that was on the other side of the divide. That's impossible today. And so all of that really matters. And it's a part of the tribute of, we've been going through the 25th anniversary celebrations of so much in Poland. That's accented. That said, very quickly to your question, the challenges which I just tick off. And first of all, there's obviously the neighborhood challenge. Ukraine, Russia, which we'll be talking about. And there is not, I think the fact that Poland is not in as much of a panic about this as it might be is precisely a result of NATO enlargement. There's no question about it. So as people say, they can question, there are always questions about Article 5, how is it, will people really rush to the defense of any, the first country that may be hit, especially in ambiguous circumstances. But the feeling in Poland is basically, we are definitely protected by NATO. Now, there are all sorts of questions about, is NATO well prepared? Is Poland well prepared? And what needs to be done? And those are some of the challenges. So I think that's something that you have to remember. And also in the minds of Poles, there's a different mentality on the Russian side about Poland. I always remember from my first tour in Moscow in the early 80s, before I got kicked out, being in Tajikistan, doing a story about young Muslims and their feelings about the war in Afghanistan. And I'm sitting in a cafe in Dushanbe, and I'm talking to a number of young folks. And of course, in that situation, as a foreign correspondent in Dushanbe, somebody's there who's there to report on you. It became quite clear that it was an Uzbek so-called student who was sitting there and jumping in the conversation. And at one point, the conversation veered to Poland, which was under martial law at that time. And his response was, "Oh, Polsza, это nasza." Poland, that's ours. You know, he's saying, I'm sitting in a cafe in Dushanbe, and Uzbek is telling me Poland is ours. Yeah, that is no longer a psychology that exists. You know, Poland, whatever the Russians think of Poles, Poland is on that other side. The other part of the external neighborhood equation is, that I think has changed in this crisis, is that, and this is a number of polls were pointing this out to me last week, I don't think it's come across as clearly in the rhetoric of the Russians these days. It's not just NATO that is the enemy, the EU is the enemy, which is, you know, that ferociously aggressive organization, the EU. That's, you know, it is the enemy as well, which, you know, the whole idea that the EU's influence is in itself a threat. So I think it's going to be really important, a challenge for Poland to maintain a strong voice on the Ukraine-Russian situation. Of course, with the new government, there's some questions about that. We can talk about it. I think there has not been as a radical shift. There have been some very inappropriate rhetorical moments, let's say. But I think someone pointed out to me, some people are saying the departure of Radek Sikorski as foreign minister means that Poland won't be as strong on Russia. In fact, Sikorski, as there several people pointed out, was not an outlier in Polish politics on Russia and by any means. He was whatever you think of his personal style, he reflected very deep convictions about Russia about most Poles. The other thing, very briefly, two other points I just make briefly about the challenges. One, domestic politics. There is the main party has been in power for a long time. It's brought a lot of stability, but there's a sense, a little bit of exhaustion, running out of ideas. And the opposition has been, at least so far, has always been one that has been more questioned and raised questions in the minds of European and American allies about, you know, the steadfastness of the Polish course. So that's you know, I think we in America have no idea about deadlock in politics and exhausted political parties, but the Poles face a little bit of that. And finally, I'd say there's a bigger European question. Yes, Poland celebrates its successes 25 years after '89, and has become so much more part of Europe. It also faces some of the same challenges as the rest of Europe. How does it maintain its economic vitality, which it's done so well, but especially when EU funds stop flowing in a few years, and it faces the same demographic downturn that other European countries do, and then it faces questions about sort of its social system. So it's going to face more maybe ordinary European problems, but maybe even a bigger challenge and a different kind of challenge than it's had to deal with before.
Thanks. Let me turn to Paula. Now, I know that you and Jan were great friends, and he was one of the group within the Polish intellectual elite in exile, together with Jerzy Giedroyc, another name that is often mentioned in the same breath as Jan Nowak. He was a longtime editor of the journal Kultura. They understood that Poland's path to democracy could not be taken alone, and that it would need the eastern neighborhood to also become free. To secure Poland's own freedom. So what do you think Jan might say today about the situation in the East? I'll just leave that a very broad question for you to address. I know you've been following events quite closely lately.
Well, thank you, Nadia. And first, let me thank the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl, you, and also the Ambassador of the Polish Embassy, just for bringing us all together. It's not only a tribute to Jan, but also a tribute to all of you and how much he was very much part of the Ned family, if I can say that, being not only a former board member, but vice chair. And I remember, and I'm going to say a few words about that. But I also, before I answer your question, just a few reminiscences. I remember especially the first time I met Jan Nowak, because I was at the NSC. And actually, he was a little bit confused because I was a younger member and he thought I was an intern, actually. And I remember I was with Walt Raymond, and Walt Raymond, because he was in Walt Raymond's office, many of you remember Walt, and Walt said, no, 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 Jan, she is really a full staff member. And so we forged a very fast and strong friendship for many, many, many years, and worked indeed. I think about the Let Poland Be Poland, the imposition of martial law. I was there during that period, and how Jan was at our doorstep constantly, and keeping our feet to the fire, and not only charting a strategic course, but also a tactical course, as Dan had mentioned. But also, I have to share something that I always think about. You know, every time I'd pick up the phone and I'd call Jan and I'd ask him a question, he had a favorite line that I can never lose. And that is, I'd say, Jan, how are you today? And he said, well, Paula, I'm still ticking. And that was one of his favorite lines. And just the gusto with which he said that. Let me say that if Jan were indeed here with us today, and in many ways, he is, because of the institutional foundations and the significant contributions that he made. First, I would say that he would underscore truly the importance of not only the post-World War II, but post-Cold War institutional arrangements. I'm totally in agreement in terms of his commitment to NATO. In fact, I even remember after he, if I could say, conquered Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, I was working at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he came in immediately and said, onward to the Baltic states. And in fact, the Council on Foreign Relations did a report on the Baltic states' entry into NATO. As you know, Jan is relentless. But the importance of NATO, the importance of the EU, these institutional arrangements were important and very relevant, of course, to the East, because these are the institutional arrangements that have kept peace, stability, and also have undergirded, literally, the evolution of where Europe is and what it's become, and its importance particularly for the East in terms of their own desires and advancement politically, economically, and no less I'd use it as in the sense militarily, but militarily in the context of a maintenance of the peace, not in terms of the definition necessarily of before. And then I would say also, secondly, as part of this, significantly, Jan was always a person about ideas and what I would call the importance of the moral narrative. In this case, he understood how it mattered not only for Poland and for those holding on to democratic values, but how crucial these values are, in fact, to those in Ukraine, in other eastward countries, in Russia. And if he were here today, I believe that he would be vigorously arguing how we have to have an outspoken moral narrative. As someone who was committed to the radios, he understood the importance of information and using radios and how ideas have to be shared and repeated and repeated. So in this context, I think he would be not just looking at the legalisms, and I say that the Budapest Memorandum for Ukraine is very important, as we know, a document that calls for the protection of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and integrity in return for it having given up its nuclear weapons. That's important indeed, and these kinds of documents. But there's a broader narrative, which is what we are about. Literally, what we are about in terms of those democratic values that undergird our democratic societies and bring us together. And I bet you that Jan would pick out Putin's speeches, not only the recent one in Valdai, but the one back in March, and where he gave a narrative that literally undercut the very essence of the values that we hold so dearly. So for Jan, I think he would be at war in a moral term, in that context, the war of ideas and of what we hold so dearly. There's a third element I would put out here, and it was mentioned this morning, and that was his establishment of the center and looking eastward. He believed firmly that the Polish model, and not just the Polish model, that actually the developments in Central Europe were of great value and consequence and could resonate with those countries eastward. And naturally, there were many synergies, and also, I was going to tease, many disputes, shifting borders at time. So in a way, Poles and Ukrainians, there is a real camaraderie and solidarity. He was a strong believer in dialogue. And, the concept of that center was an important one. And by the way, for the National Endowment Democracy, I would say he also influenced us. Because Jan, in many ways, believed it's not just only about the United States rendering its experience, but Jan was a strong believer in having grants given to Polish institutions to actually bring together initiatives spawning civil society, helping bring about think tank institutions in and throughout not just Ukraine, but other countries eastward. And so in that sense, I think the component of the person-to-person element was an important one. And I'll just feed in one example. I remember Jan calling me, and even right down to the issue of culture. He said, Paula, we have a mission together. And the mission is we have to bring some artifacts that Poland has that the Ukrainians want, and then we want some artifacts that the Ukrainians have that Poland want. And as you can imagine, when Jan sets his mind to something, it's done. And it was done. And this was in a cultural context. But those kinds of elements mattered in terms of political relationships. And let me say two last things. In this context, with regard to dialogue, as we witnessed, the crucial role that Poland has played. In 2004, I think with Ukraine, when Kuchma, as we know, did not originally ensure a free and fair and legitimate election. As you may remember, that Kwasniewski and with Javier Solana, the two of them went in and, literally got a hold of Kuchma, and Kuchma ultimately did the right thing. Poland played a critical role. Today, also we know Radek Sikorski, he was there on the ground in talking with Yanukovych, along with the French, the German, and even with Ambassador Lukin, who was in that room. And the importance of it is Poland needs to be engaged. It has a leadership role in the past, the present, and I see it for the future. Finally, I want to add a note that I don't want to lose sight of here, that I also think was another important dimension about Jan that I really came to know. It's not only about foreign policy, but back on the home front, Jan was one of the most vigorous diaspora advocates. And I think now about that. Who's in the lead? Who are the leaders? I miss Jan in this sense, because Jan was not just about the Polish-American Congress, but he was about rallying, by the way, all of the ethnic communities and having a sense of purpose, a voice, and an advocacy. Those are the kinds of things that I think Jan would be bringing to bear in terms of pushing forward the agenda of the importance of ideas and a moral narrative here with regard to the East and with regard to our post-Cold War institutions.
Thanks for sharing that. I think his role as a diaspora activist is something that is sort of often likely skipped over because there are no sort of like governmental references there, but I know a lot of people in this audience probably remember that quite vigorously. And also it reminds me of something that Jan said in the clip, that during his World War experiences, that we were right in the middle of the game. The remarks that you've given, I think, remind us that, yes, Jan always liked to be right in the middle of the game. I think he was actually referring to Poland at that point, that Poland was in the middle of the game, which it was. But Jan, by associating himself with that also, I think would be a place around which we would be orbiting right now for many of the challenges that we're looking to. I want to turn now to Peter, whom I'm not sure whether you actually knew Jan personally. Maybe not, but I do know that you do have a strong family connection with Radio Free Europe, so you know what it's all about. And as a close observer of media in this part of the world that we're talking about today, maybe you could broadly sketch out for us what do you see as the potential future challenges to take us to the present and the future?
Well, the challenges are also about human capital, and that's very clear as I listen to you, because you're right, I grew up in Radio Free Europe. My father still works there. Before that, the reason I'm English is because of the BBC World Service. I grew up in Bush House during sort of the late Cold War, the 70s and 80s. I'd go there every day after school and hang out. And I remember the BBC World Service canteen. People were there 24/7. It was one of the few places you could drink 24 hours in London.
Like in Munich, actually.
Exactly.
Until they stopped it.
Yes. Everybody was talking revolution. Everybody was talking how they were going to these sort of conversations that Novak seemed to have. I kind of grew up around these conversations, and the people that I knew as a child who, would give me Transformer presents or Mr. Men books, they would go on to be sort of ministers in governments after the Cold War ended. And I was always very reassured about Central and Eastern Europe because I knew this incredible combination of moral drive and personal bravery that these people had, and they were really heroes for me. They were hard drinking, they had heart attacks, many lovers, and they were going to win. They were fantastic. And I looked up to them a lot. And then I go to Central Europe now, and I think Poland is actually the exception. I agree, Sikorski reflects a greater Polish sort of desire to be kind of sort of strong and stand for something in Central Europe. But sadly, I think Poland might be the exception. And every day I see that generation of Novaks, of my parents, I see less and less of them. So I see President Ilves in Estonia, but for every Ilves, I see a lot more professional conformists. I see a lot of people who are very comfortable with communism, switch to being capitalists, now are toying with Putin. I see a sort of a moral relativism everywhere. For every Novak, there were a lot more people who kind of adapted to communism, lived with it very happily. And I think actually now they're on the rise. For every Maidan, there's a lot more people going, nah, well, it's the way of the world. Let's just be a little bit corrupt, a little bit pro-Putin if it suits us. So actually the trend I see is very negative. To get back to the concrete challenges that I see in media and how that might affect the work of RFE or the BBC World Service, or it really should be the local media who are doing this and aren't. In the 20th century, sort of the great challenge was for freedom of information, was the battle against censorship. Now it's slightly changed. Now it's going to be with the abuse of freedom of information. So the Russians, they're doing a little bit of censorship, but much more than that, they're taking the openness of the information space and manipulating it for their own ends. And it's actually not just the Russians, it's a global trend. I just came back from a conference about the future of public diplomacy, and there were experts from Asia and the Middle East, and I was amazed at exactly the same techniques of manipulation are being used by ISIS and Sisi, and various authoritarian states in Asia. So this is a global trend where we stand before like a deluge of disinformation and information manipulation, and we really don't have any of the institutions to deal with it the way we did in the Cold War. Neither analytical nor, in terms of offense. Radio Free Europe still exists, it does a fantastic job, but compared to the sort of the tidal wave that's coming, it just doesn't have the institutional capacity to deal with it. I'll give a few quick examples of what I'm talking about and how focusing on the Kremlin now and how it has changed its information game. It's not much less about censorship nowadays. They're doing other stuff. I mean, one thing, they've made their propaganda very entertaining. So in the 20th century, there was sort of a great package that the West had that represented the West. It was a mix of the Beatles, the Truth, did help. It was mixed in there. Merchant banking and parliamentary democracy. It all kind of mixed into one narrative. And now, basically, the Russians have said, no, you don't need the truth. You don't need parliamentary democracy, but you can have the Beatles, Taylor Swift, reality shows, and you can have all that without any of this difficult stuff about democracy. And they've totally broken our argument. They've really broken our narrative. There was a New York Times op-ed, which I thought really misdiagnosed the situation so catastrophically. it made me very depressed. One of their editorial board or op-ed writers went to Ukraine and said, "Oh, Ukraine will end up Western because they like Taylor Swift." And it's just like, oh my God, you really don't get it. So we almost don't have a story to tell. The second thing, which is even more insidious, is the use of psychological manipulation. And here, actually, the closest equivalence is how cults work. So this is not so much an information war, as it's often referred to. This is a war on information, on critical thinking, on the very infrastructure of reason. And the main weapon for that is actually conspiracy theories. So Russian TV is non-stop conspiracy theories. In the Middle East, we have non-stop conspiracy theories. Sadly, conspiracy theories are on the rise in the West. So especially among the groups who vote for sort of the rising right-wing parties, the Le Pen supporters are very into conspiracy theories. So Russia today almost creates this sort of loop between discourse and politics. They beam out support for Le Pen and conspiracy theories, which kind of boost that whole narrative in Western societies. On top of that, they'll sort of, this is more inside of Russia, they'll sort of look to break down critical thinking and then sort of injects a lot of sort of traumatic memories. So inside of Russia, it's not true that they don't talk about the Stalin period. They do talk about the Stalin period, but they do in a way that kind of like eggs on the traumas. They'll talk about the 90s. We were so humiliated. Wasn't it awful? They push that all the time. They don't do happy Russia television. They do awful, miserable Russia television in order to play on the traumas in society. And then at the end, obviously, appears Putin as the great cult leader who will make everyone happy. So there's a very deep level of psychological manipulation going on. And the idea you can just counter that with information is unfortunately just not true. I mean, we know from people who sort of do join cults, who sort of go through a similar process, just telling them the truth that like Scientology is crazy. They'll go, you don't understand, because they're being emotionally manipulated. When I talk to people in Russia at the moment, and this is not just in Russia, this is Russians in the near abroad who go through the same process. These are people who are perfectly intelligent, who do have access to other sources of information, but they've been put through such an emotional ringer by Russian media that they're already completely and utterly sort of bonded to it. And the third great challenge, and I think this is something that Novak would particularly understand, is the weaponization of information. This actually has very little to do with media as we know it. This is what used to be called active measures, black propaganda, the use of information within a military context. We've seen that very clearly in Ukraine, where information is used as a decoy. Russian TV producers at RTR would be told, focus on the humanitarian convoy 24/7. We want the whole world talking about the humanitarian convoy while we're pushing the tanks by Mariupol. And there's dozens of examples of sort of small operations being done through the media. I expect that's how Russia today is rationalized to Putin. I don't know, I can't prove that, but I always try to imagine, how does Gromov, the head of the presidential administration responsible for media, what does he say to Putin to say we need an extra 200 million for Russia today? I expect he uses the language of active measures, which is something that Putin will understand as an old KGB hand. And I think Novak, who was really on the front of that in World War II, would particularly understand. We used to have something called psyops. We kind of abandoned it. And I think in Russia, everything is now psyops. Sort of the whole sort of media infrastructure is one huge psyops operation. And we certainly don't have any kind of way to deal with that. NATO has a Stratcom division, which is kind of growing, but it's still fairly alienated from the core NATO understanding of what conflict is. And until we start thinking in terms of non-kinetic conflicts quite seriously, we're going to be way behind the curve. So these are all very big challenges, and the problem is Russia is just the tip of the iceberg. These techniques are going to be used increasingly across the world by any sort of malign state or non-state actor. So after your songs of success, I have sung of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. And I feel quite ardent, like a lot of the time, that is. But I have nothing positive to add.
Well, on that note, I actually just thank you for reminding us that actually the beginning of this story, we were focusing on heroism and courage of the previous generation. Let's just sort of keep that out there before we slide into despair. And maybe, first of all, Dan, I know that you had something you wanted to follow up, and then...
Cautionary notes are always useful, and it's wonderful to listen to a contemporary account of the Russian propaganda apparatus. It's very useful. I remember in the 1980s, similarly passionate explanations of why we were losing the Cold War and the Soviet disinformation apparatus was winning. in the 1980s. We were losing the Cold War up until 1989. Well, not all of us thought so, but many people did. We remember this. So I don't want to take issue with what you said directly, but I want to inject that cautionary note of, yeah, and I heard this back then too. Okay?
I feel better. I'm reassured.
No,
no, seriously.
You know,
I am.
where you have a larger point, and I think what Jan Nowak would have understood, is that the triumph of democracy and liberal values of 1989, and then America's work with Europeans to order the post-Cold War world to give that an institutional basis, was not the end of history. It's the, the Empire Strikes Back. Pick your metaphor. Democracy is not, the defense of democracy is not self-fulfilling. It takes action to do it. And we have to believe in it. And that's why I spend so much time invoking Jan Nowak's combination of tactical realism every single day with strategic vision. Because it's a deadly effective combination when it's put in the hands of somebody who means it. Which is why he was such an inspiration and so damned effective. Because he would push hard, he would be alarmist. The conversations usually began with, to katastrofa. And then continue, you would hear what the katastrofa was. And he would push you and beat you up. And at the end, when he had achieved whatever it was he could, which was usually less than his maximum objectives, he said, good, fine. You were friends, and on to the next issue. So, no doubt he would be warning us of however he would characterize the trends in Russia and the implications of Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. But he would also have, he would not stop with the we're losing and it's hopeless. He would have his plan and slice the problem into digestible bits and tell us what to do. And then we go off and do it.
That's the other side. I just didn't have enough time to do the solution. I usually do the hope thing. Like it's like.
I had to do it.
Yes, we need to get you something that you'll be able to slice with. Anyway, but I know Andy.
Okay, well, just a
you
quick
had
PS. Yeah, I mean,
follow-up there.
somewhat echoing Dan's point. I think your analysis was spot on in terms of what's going on in Russia. I think in our sort of the heroic narrative of the 80s, 70s, 80s, so forth, it's worth remembering most people were conformists, even in a society like Poland. I remember going out to see Lech Wałęsa trying to get people out in '85 to strike or at least make a symbolic protest. And in Gdańsk, at that point, people were tired, and most ordinary people just said, I got to get on with my life. And all the classic Havel stories. When you met him, he said, well, there are maybe 20 of us right now who are active, but it will have repercussions, and most people didn't quite believe that. So I think the nonconformists are always in the minority. The question is also, what other factors are there in the society that may change that? Aside from, I think that I agree with Paula completely, the moral narrative is really important, the radios are important, all that, but there also have to be underlying factors. And the question is, long-term for Putin, what his course, which he apparently seems to have embarked on and is so far down the road on, what it's going to mean for Russia. And I think you see the devaluation of the ruble, you see the signs of inflation, you see the sign that so far, the opinion polls all supposedly show that Putin has got 80% support and so forth. I think the one reason why Putin is pushing the narrative as hard as he is and making sure that dissent is suppressed is because of an underlying nervousness of any authoritarian figure. How thin is that veneer of support? And that when there's some cracks, and people who accepted and internalized a lot of the propaganda and the psyops will start saying, well, we were supposed to get, okay, we don't have the freedoms, but we were supposed to get stability and so forth. And now with oil declining in price and everything else, this is, maybe this is not such a great bargain. So that's also a factor to consider.
Thanks. Paula, I know you have a couple of comments maybe before.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, Peter, because you especially mentioned, what's happening at play in throughout Europe, and some of the right of center parties that are embracing similar discourse emanating from Moscow, embracing some of the statements made by Putin. I believe that this is something that Jan would take on. I think that he would be concerned about seeing some of these political trends in some of the countries. I think he would be also very steadfast. We have a sanctions policy and a strong belief that there's a need to maintain that unity and consistency. But one more that I would add in this mix, I think he would also, and this is Dan's tactical realism, I think he would also take the time and the effort to go to the Ukrainians and also tell them directly what are the kinds of things that they need to be doing. Particularly, what were these demonstrations about in the Maidan? They were about corruption. They also were about a desire to be part of the European Union and have that association. But the corruption, the need for economic reforms, I'm confident that he would see that here it's about Russia, but also the steps that are taken within Ukraine matter as much. And I wanted just to share this. In preparation, I went back. I had saved this. This was the Washington Post, had Jan Nowak-Jeziorański, January 22nd, 2005. And I only wanted to read 2 sentences. This was the tribute to Jan on the day of his passing. Indeed, his dogged, long-term, and ultimately successful dedication to democracy could almost be a model for those who wish to spread democracy now. Instead of seeking quick solutions, he shaped the perceptions of his compatriots by providing reliable information and a forum for debate, preparing them for democracy when it finally came. And it also mentions how he never really engaged in partisan politics. I would say he always was someone who brought all sides together. And I bet that's another aspect and element. He'd be out there right now and worrying about bringing Republicans and Democrats together in and on support of this important cause.
Thanks for sharing that. Peter, I don't know whether you have any comments to rejoinders, or should we?
No, I mean, there's several things. I do actually believe that this can be won, but it just has to be fought. There are ways, even the things I talked about, there are ways to counteract this. It's just we don't have the capacity to do it at the moment. So no, I do think, just as in the Cold War, it was won. It just has to be fought. And it has to be recognized as a challenge. But something that I'm thinking about as I hear you talking, and one of the interesting things about the conflict now as opposed to then is trying to understand exactly what is the threat. Because then it was kind of obvious what it was. It was like, global supremacy or something. Now it's a much cleverer, more sort of game of feints and reputations. And it's very interesting. I've been traveling across Europe trying to actually understand that. What is the threat? How do we define the threat? And it's very interesting how different it can seem in different places. In Kiev, it's existential. I mean, they would say that I'm being a little bit lighthearted and sort of like jocular. In Latvia, it's cautiously existential. You go, by the time you get to London, it's kind of like, oh, is this a problem? By the time you go to DC, where? What, Russia? Who? Who's Russia? So it's very interesting how it's very, very different. And part of what the Kremlin does, and why we do have to be very aware of this, is sort of keep London distracted, keep Washington distracted. They're very aware of kind of not dragging them in, or dragging them in just in the right way. But that's one of the many challenges we face, and something that they're very aware of, sort of always managing our perception of what they're doing.
I'm particularly interested in that you point out that we don't have the institutions to cope with the tidal wave that's coming. I think we need to sort of pick up on that at some point in the future with your participation. But I think right now, I think this rich discussion has probably created a whole tidal wave of questions, hopefully from our audience. We've covered a lot of different subjects, from Jan to the global situation to media and so on. I would like to give our audience the opportunity to pose some questions, maybe make very brief comments. We do have some microphones, and maybe if you could first identify yourselves, and then if you have a question for a particular one of the panelists, please address it to that panelist. And I think we'll start on the front row here. General Rowney first. Second.
I'm General Rowney, R-O-W-N-Y, Popolski Równy, and I'm also the president of the American Polish Advisory Council. 2 days ago, December 7th, at Yale University, we had our annual conference, and we also had 2 panels. One panel was what Polonia can do to help the visa waiver program, and the other panel was on the Ukraine. The panel on Ukraine was very spirited. We had distinguished speakers. We had the Undersecretary of State from Poland. We had the Polish ambassador to the United Nations. We had the defense attaché from here in Washington, and we had several professors from Yale, Columbia, and West Point. And the result is this very spirited conversation, much as we've been having today, about what more Polonia can do to help the situation, help the Poles live through this situation with the Ukraine. We made a commitment to reinforce what we've already been doing, and that is to go back to Congress again with another resolution backing the Congress's scheme to get more support for Ukraine democracy, for their defense programs and so forth. It was pointed out that, as it was said here a little earlier, that the diaspora is important. There are 70 million Poles, not 40 million Poles. 30 million are in the diaspora, and the United States is one-third of that, with 10 million Polish Americans of Polish descent. So anyway, I'll finally get to my question, and that is, what do you think that we in APAC can do further than reinforce our efforts with the Congress and to bring attention to the situation in Ukraine? What else further can APAC do to help the situation? I might add that we have a statement about what happened yesterday. Those of you in the press could give me your card. I'd be happy to get that statement to you at what this very spirited discussion we had yesterday, much in the spirit of Jan Nowak-Jeziorański. So what more can APAC do?
So what more can be done? Paula?
I will jump in on that question. And General Rowney, it's an excellent one. I think the role of the diaspora does make a difference. I think especially when it is working across lines, that the Poles are working with the Ukrainians, are working with the Slovaks, are working with the Czechs, the Lithuanians, and it goes on from there. So first, I think the outspokenness and the consistency of approach that this issue does matter. It is of strategic importance. Why does it matter? Because at this particular time, there are other crises that are gripping us across the globe. So you can, and you do hear many say, well, how is this situation more important than what's happening with ISIS or what's happening in another area? I would submit to say that the situation is important because it does have global ramifications. It's not just for the region. So what can they do? Continue, yes, you have to continue that lobbying. There are new members of Congress that are coming in. Secondly, I also think the issue about the question of lethal military assistance, that's before Congress. It's a critical time for Congress to hear the voice of the communities. I also think the third factor is the one you mentioned, the economic one. And here the audience is not just the United States, but I also think here the ties of many of these communities in and throughout Europe also matter greatly. In other words, that everyone has a role to play. And also, let me mention, there's even another one in this mix that we haven't mentioned this morning, the whole question of energy. And by the way, how does this come to play? Congress, you know, there's the issue about lifting up the blocks on exports of energy. It's time, in my view, that there is a revision of some of the energy policies that we have and in working with Europe. This is crucial. The community has a real role to play in vocalizing that, not only with members of Congress, with the White House, the executive branch, using every instrument possible to get those points out. And finally, I also think, going back to the point about Jan's creation of that center, I also think the people-to-people ties are absolutely essential. The next generation really does matter when you look at those who are demonstrating out on the Maidan. So in this case, I would say the next generation of the diaspora has to get out there and forge ties. That's also a new path that has to be really induced and pushed. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question on the front row there. Just a comment.
My name is Zachariashevich. Professor Brzezinski mentioned my name as a matter of fact. I happen to be the person who met Nowak when he landed in Great Britain and almost until the last moments of his life. To me, he was an unusual person. Radio Free Europe should be called Radio Jan Nowak-Jeziorański. This was his achievement. He was happy that he could recruit a group of excellent Polish journalists who happened to be abroad in London. And he has the vision. He knew what Radio Free Europe should represent. Not everybody shared his vision. He has his tough moments, short to his end of his happy life. I don't know if Nowak, whenever he is right now, he listened to our statements and his expression of friendship. And he was an unusual person. He has determination, he has vision. He understands the role of Radio Free Europe, who played tremendous role during the Cold War. He was happy that he enjoyed the support of such persons like Professor Brzezinski, Ambassador Beach, who supported him at the moment when in the State Department, the various voices, some people looking for some compromise. Janek was uncompromising. He knew what is Radio Free Europe, what is the role of Radio Free Europe. I spoke to him quite often because I happened to be appointed to the board of directors of Radio Free Europe. And every year we had a visit in Munich, and we have a conference with the directors of various sections of Radio Free Europe. This was like we listen to him. He really offers his guidance, and we try to follow his guidance because he has unusual understanding, the recognizing of the situation. I hope that wherever Jan Nowak-Jeziorański is lying right here, that he listened to our expressions, and he was a phenomenal person. Janek, we love you at that time, we love you today, and I am very happy that I have a minute to say hello to you, because I spoke to him a few days before his death. This was like a last words. He didn't expect that it would be his last days, but he has such a recognition of situation. He was living with Poland, and he was grateful to people who surrounded him, who helped him, and I'm one of these many people. And Janek, if you hear me right now, I am with you, and I'm happy that I could participate in this beautiful tribute to all he did for Poland. And your
Thank you so much.
You know how to inspire people. People love him. He has his enemies also, of course, which he suffered. We're looking for some compromises, cheap compromises. Janek was uncompromising, but he had the situation. I'm grateful to the organizers of this meeting and for letting me the chance to say hello to Janek. I love you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those thoughts, and I think it reminds us all that we all stand in awe of actually the greatest generation that went through a lot of struggles that we may not see in our lifetime. We have some questions on this side of the room. Going forward here, yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Great panel discussion. My name is Jim Wright, former Canadian ambassador, undersecretary at the Foreign Affairs Department, worked with Dan many years ago. And I was intrigued, Peter, by your comment right at the very end of your presentation in terms of that we don't have the capacities to address the challenges that are out there right now. And I'm wondering whether or not you and your colleagues could expand on that a little bit, and in particular, the role of broadcasting in terms of addressing the challenges that are there. Thanks.
Peter?
Well, it's really very simple. I mean, Russia spends between between 300 to 500 million on Russia Today and all its other broadcasters. We spend a lot less sort of broadcasting into Russia. I mean, the real cataclysm is inside of Russia, but that's a very dangerous place for there to be a cataclysm. I think a lot of it's to do with funding, and that's quite simple. But the other, the other problems are sort of ones of coordination. I mean, whenever I travel around, so the question is, who should be doing this? Should it be the Americans? It's not really, as one can tell in this room, the attitude in America is that this is not really our problem, or not a big problem for us. There are other things to deal with. Shouldn't the Europeans be getting their act together? So I know there's some movements by the European Endowment for Democracy to start at least conceptualizing the problem. But hold on, shouldn't the Ukrainians be doing this? But they're kind of hopeless. So it's this question of coordination as well. If one could pool people and create a truly, if we could recognize it's the Euro-Atlantic issue, and that we have to pool our talent and resources, I'm sure we could, take great steps. But at the moment, there is no coordination at all. So those are kind of the challenges.
Any other thoughts on that, Andy?
Well, I would just say that, yeah, I mean, of course, and one of the things that this crisis does is sort of give strong weapons for those who are advocating, for instance, reviving and really rejuvenating the radios and exploring new means of communication. But that's, as you say, it's one of many things. And I would say on the question of, and you'd hope that those discussions would be going on, because we also tend to forget that even during the Cold War, it was not just, yes, it was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, but it was also Radio France Internationale, the BBC. There are many sources that people, they were not all coordinated, but they fed into each other, and you'd hope there'd be more of that today, and sort of a boosting of everything. But I would say, and I agree, many Americans would say, well, why should we have to do this? But on the other hand, if you talk, for instance, I did in Poland last week on the issue of, say, weaponry for Ukraine, many Poles I talked to said, well, yes, we think, of course, we should give those weapons, there should be a way to get weapons to people trying to defend their country, and we are for it, but the reality is still the U.S. has to send a signal that it's for it as the leading NATO member, and for us to be able to really support it as well publicly, and we don't want to be seen as sort of these Poles, they're off on another crusade. So in all sorts of areas, I think U.S. leadership is still indispensable, as much as I think many people in the United States, in both sides of the political divide, would wish that were not it wasn't as quite as indispensable as it is.
There's also an intellectual problem, which actually might come before all the other ones. See, I was told this off the record, so I'm telling this to you now off the record as well. And I can't even verify it, but apparently in 2009, NATO wanted to set up a center of excellence for analyzing information war in one of the key NATO countries in Europe. And the key NATO country said, information war doesn't really exist. What are you talking about? Why would we be thinking about this? So first we have to recognize that this is a new type of sort of game that we don't really understand. I mean, NATO only deals with sort of very simple kinetic challenges. It doesn't really deal with any of this stuff. And the second one, intellectual problem, is having a Russia policy, because I'm not sure anyone really has one at the moment. I mean, one of the reasons I've been told that Sikorsky was maybe, oh no, I better actually not talk about that. We all know what happened to Benjuda. But there is a confusion in Europe about our Russia policy. What is it? Is Russia a strategic partner? Is it a chum? Is it a sort of like a bedfellow occasionally and then married someone else? I don't really. And in America, how do you treat it? Until there is a Russia policy, it's very hard for any of the other stuff to kind of come in line.
I think maybe a response here.
Well, now I'm on trickier ground because I'm in the administration, and these are current issues. And let me back up from the question of information war and our ability to combat it, talk about the larger context, which you just started to do, and I think you're right. It's 25 years since 1989, and so we've been at a lot of celebratory meetings, which made it feel as if what happened in '89 was inevitable and past history, and we could celebrate it without it being entirely relevant to today. So let's just stipulate, anybody think that anymore? We can't take for granted what was achieved by the previous generation. It is under pressure, maybe under assault. I would stipulate that the U.S., European, and G7 reaction to Russia's aggression against Ukraine has actually been pretty good. Now, I'm the sanctions guy, so I've been involved in it, so discount it to the degree you want. But I do not believe the Russians expected the United States and Europe to act together to the degree we did. I think that they have in mind as a formative experience 2003 and the U.S.-European crack-up over Iraq and the intra-European crack-up over Iraq. They may have comforted themselves thinking we would similarly break apart over Ukraine. We did not. We have imposed a series of increasingly tough sanctions And I think we're all past the point of debating whether sanctions work. And the Russians are happily past the point of denying it. Sanctions are not a policy, they are a tool. And I believe that the Europeans and we are considering, in fact, I know we are considering the longer range implications of what Putin has done for our Eastern policy. We had, starting in the 90s, a Euro-American Eastern policy, which resulted in the spectacularly successful expansion of Europe, NATO, the European Union. Okay. Fast forward to the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, fast forward to Ukraine today, and to Russia today. I think leaders like President Obama, Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Cameron, are all working toward a policy, an Eastern policy for this generation and this time. And those policies tend to take a while to develop. But I would stipulate that we are doing it on the basis of some rapid, joint, and effective action to help Ukraine and blunt what Russia was trying to do. Which is not to say that success is inevitable or that, you know, the triumph. You know, I'm not into triumphalism. It burns you. But we've done well, and we have much more to do. And Jan Nowak, were he here, would be telling us what we might be doing. And information is part of that, certainly. So I see this as a challenge to the current generation of policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. But we have something to work with, and the Ukrainians have one great asset that the Poles did not have 25 years ago. They've got lots of problems. They're not dealing with Gorbachev. They're dealing with Putin. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians can look at Poland and know that a post-communist transformation is possible. And the Poles had nobody to look at. There were no studies. There was nothing. The Wałęsa said that that communism is like turning the aquarium into fish soup, and his job was turn the fish soup back into the aquarium. Yeah, it's a lot tougher. There was no model. There was Balcerowicz and Michał Boni and Mazowiecki and Oszetiński just sort of making it up, and they succeeded. And if Poland could do it in the face of the dire, gloomy, fatalistic forecast that some of us in this room remember, then it at least is possible for Ukraine to take the political capital of liberation and invest it in the necessary reforms. So it's possible if we do our part and they do their part. So a little hope. I'm a policy guy. I gotta believe in hope.
Thanks for your
run off
insights.
screaming into the woods.
Thanks for your. I know Andy had a quick rejoinder and also
a quick addition, because I didn't want to leave this hanging in talking about what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. Here I disagree with Dr. Brzezinski on his point about NATO. I think it would be a big mistake, and as our Lithuanian American colleague pointed out, to say Ukraine and we make a deal with Russia, Ukraine will never be in NATO. It is not our position. It should never be our position to make that kind of a deal. Tactically, yes, right now Ukraine is not ready. There are all sorts of reasons it wouldn't happen quickly. But to say in principle this can never happen, that would be a violation of our principles. And it would be, and all the same arguments that were made against why NATO should not be considered, for NATO membership should not be considered for Ukraine. Same arguments were made about Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and then the Baltic states. I remember speaking to one of the Soviet analysts in the mid-90s during NATO expansion for Poland. I said, well, what about if the Baltic states are next? He said, that would be war. You know, it was, okay. It does, each situation is different, but we have to maintain that the era of Russia, U.S. cutting deals, saying ruling, in effect, and accepting a sphere of influence formally, that should not even be under discussion as far as I'm concerned.
Peter, quick.
Very quick. I mean, looking at I was living in Eastern Europe just as they were going through EU entry, and I do feel that for all the criticisms of the EU, it was so important they had that magnet. And what worries me about both Georgia and Ukraine is that they don't have that magnet, and they don't have that, that overarching narrative that, I mean, Serbia, weirdly enough, does. So Serbia is doing all this sort of shilly-shallying, but we're sort of confident that it's going to go in the right direction because it has this superstructure. And the Ukrainians and Georgians don't, and that's why I worry. I worry about them because of that. It's a policy thing, not a sort of existential thing.
Sure. And those are the elements that we all have to deal with. What is the policy to succeed, the post-Cold War policy, in light of current realities? But how do we advance it without giving up our basics? How do we remember Jan Nowak's tactical flexibility, long-term strategy rooted in values? All right? That's a challenge. We've laid it out. I'm not here to roll out the answers, but those are the questions that that we are actually grappling with.
Yeah. Well, that was the plan of the Eastern Partnership, and it's brought us to a clarity about the questions, we could say.
Even though you're not here to roll out the answers, I think that actually this is a good place to end this session, and I really apologize that we're running out of time. I think Jan would be thrilled with this discussion. I'm sorry that we don't have, like on the PBS or Washington Week, that we can carry on the internet somewhere in another room. We don't have that facility at the NED just yet. But we do have another part of the program that we need to get to. But I hope you all join me in thanking our panelists. Next.
I mean, you can either go into the audience or you're welcome to stay there. We're just going to be a few more minutes. Relax. I now want to invite, as our concluding speaker today, the president of Polish Radio, Andrzej Cisnewski. And in a way, we're doing this because of his visit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. It was really very interesting panel. But coming back to Jan Nowak's ideas. Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is impossible to speak about the legacy of Jan Nowak without mentioning Polish radio, an institution he was involved with since his earliest years. From his first time before the radio microphone at the age of 16, when he took part in a segment about scouting, to his heroic participation in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, where he worked with the Polish Home Army radio station codenamed Lighting, to his most notable radio role based out of post-war Munich. We salute the achievements of Jan Nowak and his team. In the main hall of the Polish Radio building in Warsaw, there is a commemorative plaque dedicated to the people of the radio from outside the Iron Curtain, who in the years of the Cold War brought words of freedom to Poland. Very close by, there is the radio studio named after the Polish section of Radio Free Europe. In this way, the Polish radio pays tribute to the veterans of the broadcast war. I had the privilege to do so in person. In the twilight of his life, Jan Nowak returned to his home country, which his spirit had never really left. I was one of those welcoming him at the Warsaw airport. I remember that that I immediately invited him to the radio. He straight away committed himself to a project to strengthen the role of our Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian sections. He was almost 90, but he literally threw himself into a whirl of activities. Soon he flew to Prague, to the headquarters of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, in order to lobby in favor of programs targeted at listeners beyond Poland's eastern border. For several years, starting from 1994, he had his permanent segment Poland from a distance on Polish Radio 1. When he moved from Washington to Warsaw in July 2002, I strongly encouraged him to continue his astute commentaries, and I had great personal satisfaction when his series called Poland at a Close Look was launched. Polish Radio awarded Jan Nowak the Diamond Microphone for the unique role he played when managing the Polish section of Radio Free Europe and promoting the transformation taking place in Poland, especially Poland's accession to NATO and the process of integration with the European Union. I was honored to present him with this highest radio award. I emphasized the importance of Jan Nowak's grand gesture, which was his undertaking after the dissolution of the Polish section of RFE to cooperate with Polish radio. I remember the words which I addressed to Jan Nowak then. At times of turbulent political transformation, few institutions and persons managed to implement the words of the first Prime Minister of the Third Republic of Poland, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, to fight for something, not against something. Today, we are continuing the radio mission of Jan Nowak. Polish public radio enjoys the greatest trust among Poles, outdistancing all its radio competitors in the category of confidence. This is our most valuable asset. I am sure that the presence of the legendary director of RFE in our broadcast from 1994 has its share in it. Ladies and gentlemen, today Poland is the leader of the democratic process in the region. In view of the dramatic situation in Ukraine, Polish Radio External Service, in cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has launched broadcasting in Russian for the Kaliningrad region and northwestern Russia. Its range also covers St. Petersburg and Smolensk. The broadcast is also received by Russians living in the Baltic countries. The programs are listened to by almost 200,000 listeners. By the way, the same transmitter is used in different hours, of course, by Radio Liberty. I see significant symbolism in this. Independent Polish public radio is repaying a debt of gratitude. In the middle of the last century, American society gave us the gift of the voice of Free Poland. We, Poles, still remember that Jan Nowak's words. May the voices of free Poles today for the first time resounding from the new station of Radio Free Europe one day resound from radio stations of Free Warsaw. These words Jan Nowak addressed on the air his compatriots behind the Iron Curtain. Hardly anyone shared the hopes contained in this message of the 3rd of May 1952, but Nowak was able to spread contagious enthusiasm. Here I am also talking about my own experience. Today, we are taking over the relay button of help to the needy in the East. In collaboration with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are transmitting the traditional radio operation addressed to our eastern neighbors into the modern Eastern portal, edited in Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian. Broadcasting in these languages will continue on the internet, which is now the most efficient replacement for traditional shortwave broadcasting. I know that RFE RL in Prague follows the same path. And speaking of the internet, I recall the portal of Polish radio. The Polish section of Radio Free Europe, Jan Nowak's work, is still being listened to. And that's without jamming, now broadcasting from Warsaw. It was with Polish radio that Jan Nowak gave its last interview. On the online site devoted to him, it is entitled An Unfinished Conversation. If someone had told me then back in 1952 that I would be able to return to Poland and live here, I would have considered that to be nonsense. To be able to come back against hope, it is a great reward. He was sincerely devoted to the cause of freedom and independence of his homeland. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to me that I could present a few personal memories associated with this remarkable man. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sosnevsky, and very beautiful remarks. And I think we'll all agree that there was something very special about this morning. Just remembering Jan, and also, as Dan said, you know, just being together. There are just so many of us who work together so closely. In the old days, I mean, we still have to work together now. I think that's one of the messages, but it's just great to have General Ronnie with us. Yale Richmond is somewhere in the audience who helped us at the beginning of the NED. Barbara Kalabinski is with us. Yatsik is such a dear friend. Walt Raymond's name was mentioned. Just very, very moving to me. And I think, you know, one of the things that Dan said about the importance of Poland and what it's accomplished and what it means for Ukraine today is just something that, with all the difficulties that we face, is so very, very important. That this, and with all, Central Europe is never, freedom is never complete, but this great success is just, should be an inspiration for Ukraine. And having, you know, as was said, the tactical realism and the strategic vision to remember this, what's big called an authentic voice of freedom, is something that I think we all need today as we try to shape a course in dealing with the immense difficulties that, you know, that we face in the world today with Putin, with Russia, and with other problems as well. Ambassador, I want to let you know how grateful I am for bringing us together. The Polish Embassy is graciously going to be providing us with a wonderful lunch outside, well prepared, and we're very, very grateful to you. Thank you all very much for coming.